Veuillez vous asseoir. Come sit down, and it's not like church, you can actually sit up front. Bonsoir et bienvenue à l'Université du Maine à Fort Kent. Welcome to the University of Maine at Fort Kent. Tonight's presentation is organized by the Acadian Archives, Archives Acadiennes, with financial support from the Maine Acadian Heritage Council and the University of Maine at Fort Kent. An event of this magnitude is impossible without the help of many talented people. Among them are Anne Chamberlain, Archive Specialist, Dr. John Short, Kim Deschênes, Office Manager of the Maine Acadian Heritage Council, Carrie Watson-Blaisdell and Sue Tardy from the PR Office, Erin Bernstein, Steve Michaud, and Mike Roy and the staff at Sodexo. And of course, Michael Hillard and the guest panelists, who will be introduced shortly. Dr. Hillard will present his research of the 1971 Fraser Paper mill strike, culminating in an audio documentary which aired on Maine Public Radio in September 2016. Dr. Hillard will not be taking questions or comments during this portion of the evening. Following the documentary, a panel of experts will come to the stage to answer questions from the audience. It is now my pleasure to invite the President of the University of Maine at Fort Kent, Dr. John Short, to present our honored guest speaker.
Bonsoir, bienvenue. Thank you for being here. Good evening and welcome. Before introducing tonight's featured speaker, I'd like to take time to call your attention to the important aspect of UMFK's mission that dedicates this campus to the preservation of Acadian history and culture, to support for research, teaching, community outreach, all of this mainly through our Acadian archives. When a student or parent visits the University of Maine at Fort Kent, they can't help be impressed with our signs in English and French, with our bilingual community, and with our location on the border that stresses our unique aspect of history and our unique mission within the University of Maine system. I'd also like to call your attention to the fact that UMFK is committed to extending and strengthening this part of our mission to an important partnership with the University of Southern Maine, with collaboration with the University of Moncton, and Dr. Nicole Lang, an expert on the Fraser Paper mill. Finally, I would like to thank Lise Pelletier, Director of the Acadian Archives, for her dedication and commitment to highlighting and preserving Acadian history and culture. Not a day goes by that Lise doesn't tell me about how we need to do more, how we need to talk to students, how we need to have faculty put items in their syllabus about the unique aspects of the Acadian Archives, and for her I'm most grateful. I also want to thank her, of course, for planning tonight's event. I met Dr. Michael Hilliard not at this past meeting of the Board of Trustees that was held in Portland, but in the one before that. He stopped by my table where we were having dinner. He was a speaker about, I guess, food studies, and we had a conversation about his research on the Fraser Paper mill. He talked about working with the Acadian Archives, with Lise Pelletier, and how satisfying it was, the research that he's done. In fact, when we talked today, he wanted to make sure that I know how gratifying it is to present your research to people who really appreciate it. Too many times, scholars present their work only to other scholars. Dr. Michael Hilliard is committed to public outreach and to, in fact, translating scholarship into a public discourse, whether through op-eds, through his newspaper articles, through documentaries, and through talks like his presentation this evening. Dr. Hilliard is a professor of economics at the University of Southern Maine, where he's also executive director of the Food Studies program there. He's written widely about various topics, including labor relations, labor history, and the political economy of labor, and he's been active in studying the history of Maine workers since coming to Maine in 1986. He currently is involved in research related to the Maine food-based economy, and he participates in public policy debates on issues affecting Maine's working people. Dr. Hilliard previously studied the Fraser Paper mill strike of 1971 in terms of labor relations and economics, but most recently examined the historical records with a focus on the French-Acadian heritage of the Fraser workers and the relations with the Canadian Anglos of Fraser's management. In analyzing that 11-week strike that included civil disobedience, destruction of train tracks, and involvement of the Maine State Police and the intervention of the then Maine Governor Kenneth Curtis, Dr. Hilliard is currently completing a book-length manuscript on labor relations in the Maine paper industry. He also has produced 2 labor documentaries, including Madawaska Rebellion. Dr. Hilliard's resulting audio documentary is a major resource in understanding that event in the context of colliding cultures in labor relations. Please help me welcome Dr. Micah Hilliard.
Hello everyone, it's really a great honor to be up here at UMaine Fort Kent. I want to first thank especially Lise Pelletier, the Acadian Archives, University of Maine Fort Kent. Thank you, John, for that gracious introduction. I'm very grateful to the panelists who are going to be joining us tonight, who have been incredible resources in my work. And I just want to thank the people of the St. John Valley, about whom I knew very little, if anything, over 10 years ago. And this is my 4th trip, and the only short trip. All my other trips have been for a week or so. And it's been an amazing experience to find this amazing gem in Maine that people often, my end of the state, don't know too much about. Although I had been hearing about it for years from my students, so it wasn't a complete surprise. What I'm going to try and do in about 10 minutes is just explain who I am and why I came to do this work. And then I think the real star of the show is not me tonight, but the people of the St. John Valley, people of Fraser, whose story are told in the radio documentary that I'll share with you tonight. Why am I doing this? I decided about 20 years ago, based on some local folks at a paper mill called S.D. Warren outside of Westbrook, outside of Portland and Westbrook, who were coming to my classes because they knew they were going to lose their jobs soon. They were studying business, they were studying economics. And I got to talking to them about the stories that they had about this mill, and in a very short period of time I realized it was a great topic to dig into. So ever since then I've done now upwards of 175 oral history interviews, and I found myself wanting to tell the entire story of the Maine paper and logging industry. I don't quite get to all of it, but I do tell the arc of the rise of the industry and its fall. And I've especially focused on case studies of specific communities, because paper mills are not just economic units, they're embedded in people's lives, and it's very much so when you're talking about paper mills or the work in the woods. So this is 150 years in 6 minutes. We'll see how I do. So first of all, why did the paper industry come to Maine? What I usually say in my writing and my public speaking about the industry is that for a certain period of time, from the 1890s to the 1960s, Maine was to paper as Detroit was to the automobile industry. We were the most important state. We were the heart of what went on in national paper production. People know about Ford and the assembly line and Detroit, but they don't know about the story of people here in Maine and the industry that sprouted up. Why did it come here? It's kind of a cool story. You may or may not know this, but for about 2,000 years we made paper out of cloth rags. That was the raw material to get the fibers that you need to make paper. And then a couple things happened in the 19th century. One thing was called the Industrial Revolution, which was hitting stride in the United States in the mid-1800s. Population growth was expanding, literacy was expanding. And with all of that, there was a great opportunity to mass produce paper, but you couldn't do it with cloth rags that you got from dumps here and in Europe. And so there was a mad scramble to find a new technology, and by the 1870s, German and American chemists and engineers had figured out how to make paper from trees, specifically spruce trees. And then what happened between then, I'd say the 1870s and the beginning of the 20th century, was a realization that we have to find a place that has a lot of water, a lot of spruce trees, and the kind of workforce that can make a complicated new kind of factory process work. And after a search for a little bit, they found Maine was the place. 7 major river systems, 18 million acres of woods, half of it high quality spruce for making paper. And so using the new sulfide and groundwood processes, the paper industry came to Maine. It was kind of a gold rush on the frontier. Between the 1890s and the 1920s, you see a list of companies whose names most of you should be familiar with, who were founded, and each of them built large paper mill complexes with all the different components of it, including pulp mills and wood yards and finishing departments, and employing eventually up to thousands of people on each individual site, not to mention all the loggers in the woods cutting the pulp wood. We specialized in highly profitable types of paper, publication papers being at the front, specialty products of all kinds. If I had time to bore you with details, it's just amazing the list of all-star paper products that were made in Maine. In newsprint for some companies like Great Northern Paper. And the thing to know about mills, you guys live in this community. You've been driving by the Edmundston Pulp Mill and the Fraser Paper Mill for your whole life, so you know what it looks like. It's a large complex. But even if you go back over 100 years ago, from the very beginning, these were technologically sophisticated, capital-intensive mill operations, and the focus was on 2 things. The way those companies were very successful is producing high-quality papers, and quality is a very tricky matter when it comes to paper production, and constantly adapting and developing new products. All of the mills in the state did that. All of them developed their own on-site research and development and testing operations. So very high-tech, very high profitable industry. And what that brought was a stability in terms of a long-run success that lasted for about 75 years. And in the context of that, mills were able to build stable labor relations with their workers. As most people know, working at a paper mill, relative to other pursuits in Maine, was a well-paying job. I'd like to stop and talk just briefly and honor the nature of the work. I've met some gentlemen here who I've not met before who worked in the mill for decades. I've been talking for almost 20 years to paper makers, reading, studying, visiting mills. It's really an amazing story. How does paper get made? The most important feature of it really are the collective machine skills of people who may work on a digester or on a paper machine or a coder or a winder, whatever, for years and sometimes decades. And it's that knowledge and skill and the ability and willingness to keep those machines running, keep the product high quality, make all the adjustments all day long, that make these industries very profitable. So all of these paper mills really had a close collaboration between the engineers, the managers, and the workers themselves, and no one group was more important than the other. The other thing that's always worth, I think, acknowledging if you've not worked in a paper mill is just how hard it is to work in a paper mill. And I'm saying this not as somebody who's done it, but I've heard dozens and really probably hundreds of people talk about it at this point. You're walking to a factory that's hot in most places, most times of the year, like hot 120 degrees, 140 degrees where you are. It's a chemical factory. It's dangerous. Every paper mill in the state has a history of fatalities, not to mention arms and limbs and other things that have been crushed and destroyed. And the punishing nature of shift work over an entire career of doing that graveyard shift once a month for a week. During that era, up until the 1960s, all the mills had what I call local ownership, and you'll notice quotation marks around local. I say that because often the owners might have been in a city somewhere else in the region, Boston, New York, Toronto, Montreal. But what you had is a group of families, that usually one or a couple families that founded a mill and led it in its early years. Here at Fraser, it was 2 Frasers and Brebner initially, and then usually within the first generation or 2, you'd bring in some top professional managers from somewhere else. In this case, it was mill managers named McLaughlin and Crabtree, who worked from the 30s, ran the company from the 30s up to the 60s. And with the sort of stability of that local ownership and the ability to cultivate long-term relationships, that you've got stable relations, labor relations, where people really collaborated with each other. Fraser early on, fully up and running, started construction in 1917 in Edmundston, and both sides of the river were finished by 1925. And the biggest product that they bagged and made a lot of money off for a long time was the Sears catalog. All right, so why did the strike happen? There's actually a big picture of which the strike is part of, and I wanted to share with you tonight. The first part of that big picture is that the paper mills in New England, and especially in Maine, that had been at the top of their game, and in the 50s, 60s, they were making money hand over fist. All of a sudden they have these headwinds because new technology allowed paper mills to move into the South, where you could grow trees very cheaply, very quickly, using new processes. And so mills were facing greater needs for capital at a time that markets were starting to stagnate somewhat, in which competition was becoming ever stronger. And so the solution, at least in the corporate world, was to merge paper mills that used to be regional and local into large companies like Georgia Pacific, Scott, and what have you. So I'll come back to that in a second. The other thing is that this was the last great strike era in the United States. From the mid-1960s to mid-1970s is the last time in the United States when strikes across the country were frequent, were done often on the offensive on the part of workers, and were often won by workers. We had lots of strikes in the 80s, but those were defensive strikes, and for anybody who knows the words Boise, Cascade, Rumford, or J, International Paper, you know what that turn was later on. But there was this moment in the 60s and 70s where we had a great rebellion in this country. Not everybody remembers it, but it did take place. Just as a matter of comparison, in a typical year during that period, in 1966, 2 million people struck. 40 years later, in the same kind of part of the business cycle, 70,000 people struck. Why did all these strikes happen? Well, there's a general theme to them, which is changes in top-down forces and changes in bottom-up forces. So the top-down forces were, as I've described here, the headwinds facing the industry and the loss of local control. You bring in people from outside who don't respect the local traditions, they don't respect the workers that they're necessarily coming in to manage, and they think that they can squeeze them or get them to do things in a different way, and they do it without respect. That is a main theme that I've found all across the state from this era. The bottom-up forces is that people were rebelling in the entire planet in the 60s and 70s, right? People fired up about all kinds of things, and people would be fired up and they'd have an experience over here on a college campus, you know, in a civil rights struggle, and then they would bring it over here and carry it into a labor struggle. So this was going on everywhere, and it certainly happened here. And so there's a list of just some of the companies that had strikes, and also a major strike I'm going to be telling the story of in my book, and will be my next radio documentary if I can get the funding, which is the Maine Woodsman Association strike. Some of you may recall the MWA was formed in 74 and 75, and it actually had a brief strike that shut down most of the state's industry. It's quite a story. So Fraser had 2 strikes you'll hear about tonight. The first one was a wildcat in 1970 in the middle of a contract, and then the major strike in 1971. So as I said, these strikes shared the common forces that these were all companies that were merging, brought in new outside forces. The particular story that you'll hear tonight in the documentary is a little bit distinct in that instead of Fraser having been bought out or merged with a big company, they were trying to forestall that by bringing in a tough new set of managers. It's basically the same economic phenomena at work. But all that said, I heard about this strike in 2000, 2001, people saying, hey, this strike happened up in the valley. They blocked the trains. It was a crazy strike. That's all I really heard. I had some students who were from the area, from the valley, who'd done a little bit of you know, simple undergraduate papers on it. I was familiar with it. So I came here for the first time in 2008, and Paul Sear, who you'll see tonight, commenting, was the first person I interviewed. And I started to get the details about the strike, and really was excited to actually go back in history and have people who were there at the present. But he mentioned this thing, it's like, well, why did the people know how to do this? And he said, it had something to do with our Acadian heritage. And I knew that this was a French-speaking area, but I was naive. I didn't know what that really meant. And the wonderful thing, you know, my own personal experience is that over the next 6, 7 years, I did tons of interviews, met dozens of people in the community, and I now really appreciate what that means, and I think it's reflected in the documentary. So just to finish with, what was my research? I had 2 questions to answer. What happened was one. I looked at the written record. The St. John Valley Times, a remarkable resource because of, it was actually really an actor in the strike as well as just a medium. I interviewed 20 or so direct participants, and many of the experts in the room here. You have a great set of resources here, Nicole Long, Elise Pelletier, Guy Dubé, and others who really have, Don Sear, an amazing set of local historians who I think have really captured the story of the Acadians in the St. John Valley, and from whom I learned. And I'll finish with this. The exciting thing for me was to find out the why. And here, in the first interviews I did with people who I didn't know, I weren't really prompting them to say this. They talked about the divide between the English and the French. The English managers from away, the French who are the local people here. And the disdain and disrespect in the mill, and how that overlapped with the larger stories about treatment in schools, not being allowed to speak French in the schoolyard, all that kind of stuff, getting disciplined for that. And without saying much more, because I don't want to step on the story of the documentary, which we'll start here in a second, but to me, I think it was a moment where the civil rights movement and the labor movement around the country and really around the world were merging in many places, and I think that's really what the story was here. I think it was a moment of an assertion of French power that helped define a new era for the people of the valley. So with that, is Aaron here? Yeah. Okay. Yes, so let's get the documentary going. So, here he comes. I've been using technology at my University of Southern Maine for 20 years, and I still can't make anything happen without the guy. And tonight, Aaron is the guy. And thank you, Aaron. And Aaron will start, and it runs roughly 50 minutes, and thank you so much for being here tonight. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all. Thank you.
The place is Madawaska, Maine, just this side of the U.S.-Canadian border.
Once you travel north, you'd see the French-Acadian mindset. We are the other Maine.
There are uprisings and protests going on all over the world, and this town has had its own conflict brewing for years.
I remember an employee saying to me, if I was English, I could have your job.
That August, it turned into something else.
We started watching these guys coming at us in formation, dressed in the riot gear.
Things erupted. We stood there wondering how the hell we were going to get out of there.
I think it's part of our culture. Either you fight or you lose.
Today, we present the story of how a small community, united by their heritage and their livelihood, took on the town's largest employer and the state police. The story of the strike at Fraser Paper. Madawaska is a manufacturing town in the northernmost tip of Maine, the largest community in the area, known as the Upper St. John Valley. It was settled in 1785 by 16 Acadian families who had escaped deportation from Acadie, now known as Nova Scotia, a generation before. Kim Willett grew up there nearly 2 centuries later.
It's beautiful, very rural, somewhat secluded.
Even after all these years, the community's identity remains connected to its Acadian roots.
My first language was French. I learned how to speak English by watching Sesame Street. Seriously.
Richard Marston moved to Madawaska in the mid-60s. The valley wasn't like other places he had lived.
If you went into a restaurant, people spoke to you first in French. And when they found out that you didn't speak French, they would switch to English.
Madawaskan culture can be distilled to 3 main traits: the French language, the Catholic faith, and a fundamental sense of togetherness.
You work hard, you contribute to the community, you participate.
There were large families here. I remember families of 24 children with no twins.
Everybody played with each other. Everybody knew each other's business. I mean, that whole area is just a large, extended family.
It's a family that's been made closer by a discrimination that goes back to the beginning.
A lot of people from Madawaska identify themselves as Acadians.
Elise Pelletier is the director of the Acadian Archives at the University of Maine at Fort Kent.
And when I say, well, what does that mean for you? People from whatever generation would say, our ancestors were kicked out by the British. And this fact that they were sure of was not taught in the schools. This is what their families told their children.
Many French-speaking Canadians moved to Maine during the Industrial Revolution to work in mills and factories.
The number of French workers was seen as a menace. The industrialists felt threatened. What if some hothead started talking about work conditions? The authority could be reversed or removed. That was enough to start a campaign in the newspapers that they want to destroy our Protestant way of life. The stereotypes were the French were stupid because they didn't speak English. They had to be oversexed because they had so many kids. And they were a little bit crazy because they believed in the Pope being an infallible person.
Anti-French propaganda was part of a general climate of xenophobia. The Ku Klux Klan had gained great influence in Maine, and in 1919 they pushed through legislation that forbade the speaking of any language but English in Maine schools.
There was a lot of discrimination against French people. In fact, when I was in grade school, we could not speak French in school. That was voodoo.
Like many of Madawaska's current residents, Paul Sear remembers a common childhood scene.
At recess, when you're playing and you're a kid, you're going to revert to your natural language, and we'd get caught in the schoolyard speaking French, and the nuns would take us inside and wrap our fingers with the big ruler, and if you got caught several times, they'd wash your mouth out with soap.
Former State Senator Judy Parody is a lifelong St. John Valley resident.
Children would start kindergarten monolingual French, and they would have to eliminate it. So we didn't know the difference between, you don't like my language, you don't like my face, you don't like me. How could a child separate that?
It was insinuated, if you speak French, you're going to be stupid the rest of your life.
When they were punishing children for speaking French, it was mostly the boys. And I used to think, silly them, we the girls spoke all the French we wanted, but they never caught us. I was judging them to be not very bright not to be able to get away with this. And then I realized they were rebelling. When you start working when you're 9, 10 years old in the fields, you acquire some confidence in yourself. And so I think now I realize that that's what they were doing. They were not going to take this.
Maine's Franco-American workers, though they were looked down upon by many English speakers, were essential to the state's major industries, especially paper. When 3 Scottish brothers named Fraser built a paper mill in Madawaska in 1925, they found a strong and able workforce in the local French population. For the farmers of the upper St. John Valley, this was a tantalizing opportunity to attain a steady middle-class livelihood, and many of them decided to do so. By the time Dan Daigle was a Fraser employee in the 1960s,
they employed at least half of the townspeople. If you wanted to stay local, it was kind of like an accepted way of life. The wages were good, the benefits were good. You get into the mill, and you're all set for life.
Fraser was the heart of the town.
Dan's wife, Debbie.
There's nothing else really as far as financially. I mean, you know, it was a lifeblood.
Although many families still maintain small farms, Madawaska was no longer a farming town. The way of life had been transformed.
8-hour shifts. Punch out, stop at the bar for a couple beers, and then go home. It was Milltown mentality, Milltown activity, Milltown.
Fraser's facilities spanned both sides of the border. The plant on the Canadian side turned lumber into pulp, which they pumped across the border to Madawaska, where it was transformed into a variety of papers by workers like Jerry Sear.
We made Bible paper, we made Teleco, Sears Directory.
Richard Marston worked in Fraser's Human Resources Department starting in the mid-60s.
Catalog paper was good business in those days. Everybody that was in it was making money. Pennies, S&H, food stamps. We were making paper for the filters on cigarettes, the brown paper. And in those days it had white spots for whatever reason. We were trying to get those white spots in that brown paper.
It was like many of the incredible mills in Maine that made Maine like the Detroit of paper in the mid-20th century. It was the biggest paper producing state, and they made the most elegant, kind of high-end papers.
Michael Hillard is an economics professor at the University of Southern Maine who has studied the Maine paper industry. He conducted many of the interviews heard in this program for his research.
In the period after World War II up into the 1970s, it was an economic situation that manufacturers longed for. There was more demand for the paper than supply at almost all times.
In this era, jobs at Fraser were generally secure, though they weren't always comfortable.
It was always hot in the steam plant anyways, summer, winter, spring, or fall. Over 100 degrees and lots of humidity. And on the paper machines, if you have to go under the hoods, passing the sheet, you're in 130, 140 degree heat.
Beyond the unpleasant atmosphere, mill work could be truly dangerous. Paul Sear worked at Fraser during the 1970s.
Walking into a paper mill, you walk into a chemical soup in terms of the atmosphere that you're breathing. People breathe that over a lifetime, and very few people, at least in the 70s and the 80s, nobody lived to retire out of a paper mill in this state. I shouldn't say nobody, there are people that made it, but the vast majority did not.
In addition to the chemicals, the noise, the heat, and the huge machines that could crush a man's arm between giant rollers, there was the stress of an inconsistent work schedule.
We'd work 7 days, 12 to 8, 2 days off, 7 days, 4 to 12 shift, 1 day off, 7 days, day shift, 4 days off. You just kept rotating like that. The hardest part was the 12 to 8 shift. I had a hard time sleeping in the daytime. It would mess up your eating habits, your digestive system.
In exchange for their sacrifices, Fraser workers enjoyed steady, lifelong employment. The company maintained state-of-the-art research and development laboratories that steadily introduced new types of paper. Company salesmen fanned across the country, pulling in customers from many industries. The unionized workers were compensated as well as those in any industry in the state. Mike Walsh worked in human resources at Fraser Paper for 20 years.
At the time I was there, we were rocking. Because at the time, they reinvested in the equipment. And we had, although sometimes contentious relationships with the unions, we were able to negotiate successful contracts.
In the mid-60s, the biggest American corporations were in the midst of a merger craze, seeking an elusive magic called synergy. For larger companies like International Paper, Scott Paper, and Georgia Pacific, this meant buying up smaller companies like Fraser and putting their mills through a process called rationalization. Investment in new technology and the arrival of new managers armed with the latest efficiency strategies was considered a surefire way to whip these smaller mills into shape, pushing their profitability to new heights.
La rationalisation, I have problems saying that word in English.
Historian Nicole Long.
When you read the minutes of the meetings of the board of directors and the executive committee, you feel that they're really nervous. They believe that Fraser had to become more competitive so that the shareholders remain faithful to the Fraser Companies Limited. They had to make technological changes to be more efficient. They felt also that they had to cut the number of workers. And they felt they had no choice because they could not remain independent if they did not move on this.
So in 1968, Fraser's board voted to rationalize the company themselves instead of letting some larger corporation swoop in and do it for them. They hired a tough set of managers from a rival company, Great Northern Paper, to come in and modernize the Madawaska mill from the ground up. The new company president was the hard-charging John Hoyer.
He was a real action guy. He made things happen, and he made things happen rapidly, right? And so he would ruffle a lot of feathers.
This is Peter Egan, whose father worked with Hoyer at Great Northern Paper.
You know, my father and Hoyer drank and smoked. Hoyer drank whiskey and smoked 10 cigarettes in 5 minutes, and my father would drink a martini and smoke 3 cigarettes in 5 minutes. Hoyer was absolutely a guy that they would all follow into battle.
Hoyer's arrival coincided with the 1968 negotiation of the mill's union contracts. Hoyer made the case that Fraser was facing a moment of crisis, and he succeeded in persuading the unions to accept the change that they'd been resisting for years. Richard Marston.
In those days, Sunday was a very sacred thing for the folks here, the Acadian people. So the mill was not operating on a 7-day schedule.
In that contract, finally, they said yes to Sunday work. And you have to remember that the majority of the workers are French and are Catholics. For them, it was a really big concession. The company then promised, if they made that concession, that it would create new jobs.
The parts of the contract that ensured these new jobs were called the Manning Letters. Michael Hillard again.
What the Manning Letters did was to specify how many workers would be needed for a specific process. Hoyer had built $60 million of new machines, telling the workers that our part is asking you to give us these breaks so that we can restore profitability. What we will provide for you is hundreds of new jobs to go along with the expansion. So that's the significance of the Manning Letters.
With the new contract signed, Hoyer began an overhaul, a plan he dubbed the Big Thrust. The man to enact it was his new production manager, Marty Roach.
He used to go around the mill with a stopwatch, and he used to time the workers to see the time for each task that was made. It's as if they were under a microscope, and they were really being watched all the time. That's why they called him the cockroach. Coquerel, it's an insect that you want to get rid of. And when they saw him coming, the workers told me that they became a bit aggressive towards him because they knew that what that guy was trying to do is find ways to cut jobs.
The Big Thrust challenged the way Fraser's paper makers had been doing their jobs, some of them for decades. It bothered them that the new managers were looking over their shoulders rather than talking to them face to face. Workers Dan Daigle and Jerry Sear.
In the paper industry, there is nothing like experience. Prior to the days where the paper machines were computer controlled, these men were going just by the feel, the sound, the touch. It was really mind-boggling to watch some of these men work.
As you make your rounds on a paper machine, you're listening to motors, you're listening to pumps. If there's a vibration in the pump, you'll hear it. If there's a motor whining, you'll hear it.
An experienced machine tender would tell us, I'm going to make such and such an adjustment, and this figure should jump from here to there. And on the following reel of paper, he was dead on to what he had told me.
Let me put it this way, you're not going to take somebody on the street and put him up there for 2 weeks to make a paper maker.
But as the management style changed, they had a mindset that if you had a college degree, you didn't have to know the job to be a manager. When they started preaching this to us, I told the guys, I smell a rat. And it is absolutely impossible for these guys to come out of school and show you boys how to make paper.
The senior managers were very difficult to deal with. They were very command and control oriented. They were not used to having to sit down and talk over issues. They were used to, this is the way you're going to do it, and you know, it was more, they were in control.
See, Hoyer had a kind of a short fuse. And I think this was a strategy that he used, to be honest with you. So he would go in and just get everybody kerflummoxed. He wanted to make it clear that there wasn't going to be any questioning and there wasn't going to be any messing around. If he went in and said, okay, we're doing this, and there was somebody raised an eyebrow, that wasn't going to work. No, don't raise your eyebrows. I just think Hoyer just had he had a vision, and he didn't need any naysayers, and he would crush the opposition.
Papermaker Lucian Mazerow.
At that time, the atmosphere started changing because there was a feeling amongst the worker that these two individuals coming from another town We're not up here to look after the best interest of the people. And that's really starts some kind of animosity and hard feeling between workers and management.
There's an expression in French, we say une atmosphère à couper au couteau. It means that the atmosphere is so dense that you could take a knife and slice it in two. No? And the workers use that expression with me. No? And it tells it all. It was really a stressful time at the mill because the workers didn't know what would happen in the near future.
The big thrust had stirred up feelings in the Fraser workforce that went beyond the frustration of an outsider telling you how to do your job. There was also the sense that this lack of respect was about who they were.
In those days, all of the management people were English-speaking people.
Richard Marston was one of those English speakers. He worked in human resources.
There was almost no one in the management group that had a Franco-American background.
The mill opened in 1925. From the start, it was clear that management jobs, good-paying jobs, specialized jobs, were given to the English, people who came from outside the region, and the low-paying jobs, the labor jobs, jobs that were less interesting but were harder physically, were given to the French.
And there was actually an English section of town, bungalows, that were located near the mill. Those tended to be supervisory people that lived in those.
They did not mix with the population. They sent their kids to English school. They went to different churches. Very few families mixed and even talked. It was kind of two societies having parallel lives. All these managers, all these guys who were engineers, who had jobs in the laboratory, once they retired, they left town. It was not their community. I think it helps us understand why some of them really never got it and really had problems negotiating with the workers.
It was a love-hate relationship because the mill is both the savior and also the oppressor. It provides good money and income, but it also rules your life.
We all knew the leadership that we had there, which we're talking the upper up, did not respect French people.
Papermaker Ron Albert.
Hoyer and those people, yeah. The less we give those Frenchmen, the more money we make, and they're stupid, they'll do it. I've seen a boss there actually kick a guy in the butt because he wasn't moving fast enough. How much can you take of that?
Coming up, the tension at Madawaska's Fraser Mill reaches its breaking point. After this.
Tensions at Fraser Paper grew steadily in the period after the 1968 contract. The unions had agreed to work longer hours, including Sundays, in exchange for assurances in the form of manning letters that more paper coming out of the mill would translate to more jobs. For a community that thought of itself as one big extended family, the manning letters were critically important. Historian Nicole Long.
Those new jobs were never created, And what's worse in 1970 is that they had started cutting back jobs. More than 70 jobs had been lost. The workers feel that the company is not respecting a contract. And they feel that they are being played here.
In June 1971, union leaders met management to negotiate a new contract. They found that Hoyer and his team were still not interested in following the Manning letters, and in fact wanted to eliminate them altogether.
I think management, they had this mentality of wanting to take on the union. There was friction in the good old days, but it was productive.
People just need to be treated with dignity and respect, and if everyone was treated with dignity and respect, and you did not have corporate people that were totally greedy and one-sided, you wouldn't need unions.
If you're making the money, you know, the money should be there to support the worker, you know, because they get rich by the workers. That's how it works.
If one side or the other perceives that they have more power than the other side, and that balance of power gets used, the strike usually results.
That's usually what happens when people are oppressed. When they've had enough, they rebel.
Management was pushing, and we were being pushed against the wall, so we just walked out. Everybody out. Picket and everything. We just closed the mill down.
The nearly 1,000 unionized employees set up headquarters at the local Knights of Columbus Hall and began a 24/7 picket line. There were 4 unions at Fraser, Locals 247 and 252 of the United Papermakers and Paperworkers, Local 365 of the International Brotherhood of Pulp, Sulfite, and Paper Mill Workers, and Local 232 of the Office and Professional Employees International Union. All 4 had voted to go on strike, effective at noon Friday, July 9th, 1971. The local newspaper, the St. John Valley Times, became one of the only lines of communication between unions and management throughout the strike. In addition to daily front-page coverage of the latest developments, the paper agreed to publish statements by both union and mill leadership at no cost. A war of words ensued.
The company does not want to strike and regrets the inconvenience and hardships this will bring to our employees and the communities. When the strike is over, we will have the difficult job of winning back our customers.
They are now trying to make us believe that this strike is causing them to lose their customers, when other companies are filling out their orders for them with an understanding that when things get back to normal, Fraser takes their customers back.
Fraser insisted that if they gave the unions what they wanted, the mill's very existence would be threatened. And their shipping partners, led by the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, sent their own letter to the paper, pleading to readers that the strike could destroy all their livelihoods.
Who wins if Fraser loses? Not the happiest thought, but have you considered it? What could replace paper in northern Maine? Sugar beets haven't yet proven to be the answer, and Maine potatoes are having a time of it too.
The unions said the biggest issue was not money, but what they called a morale problem.
The morale problem started when management saw fit to do the reverse of what had been proposed by the company in 1968 in order for them to influence the people to accept the 7-day operation schedule.
According to the unions, Fraser had increased automation, combined jobs, and worked them longer hours, which allowed the company to operate more paper machines without hiring more workers. All of the things that the Manning letters were supposed to prevent.
With this in mind, can you now visualize why the union people feel that these letters are so important to them? The company again this year says, "Come now, fellas, trust us, have faith in us." We ask the company this, with its past practices, how can we trust you?
For the unions, the problem wasn't just that the Manning letters had been ignored. It was that ignoring the Manning letters exposed a deep disrespect.
How does a company who treats people like this even dare ask cooperation? The present management has never heard of human dignity, and it does not seem as if they want to learn. A strike may not have been the answer, but to keep working under such pressure and abuse is not the answer either.
Despite the lively back and forth in their newspaper, actual negotiations were still not taking place. And of course, neither was paper production.
They set up picket lines and pretty much nothing moved in and out of the mill except for the management people.
All the businesses in town, they brought down sandwiches for the people, and the whole town was backing the workers.
Everybody was on pins and needles, because if there's no salary coming into the household, they're not going to be shopping.
I remember there was a place called Bert's Hot Dog Stand, who every day of the strike, I believe, would make a chicken stew, and he would bring it down to the picket lines and feed the workers.
There must have been a lot of chicken stew made, because the strike went on for days and then weeks. For workers, this took a major financial toll. They received weekly stipends from the union, which were only a small fraction of their usual pay, and some workers were forced to move away and find new jobs. After nearly a month of 24-hour picketing, there has still been no negotiations, and none were planned. On the morning of Thursday, August 5th, the front page of the St. John Valley Times read, "Fraser's situation just about the same, no settlement in sight." But the real news that day was back on page 7, where Fraser had printed a full-page ad that began with this provocative question.
What does it take to move a mountain? A mountain of paper, that is. Today, Fraser has a mountain of paper waiting to be moved to its customers. Sometime shortly, this paper will be moved, and we hope with the cooperation of the strikers. Our customers need this paper. We fully intend to keep our customers happy.
Management seemed to think that announcing their intentions would ensure that workers stayed out of the way. This turned out to be a miscalculation. Worker Camille Bernier.
They were telling us exactly what they were going to do. People said, you're going to move a mountain over our dead body.
What does it take to move a mountain? Without major highway access in Madawaska, paper shipments were made by train. The Bangor and Aroostook Railroad operated a line which led directly to Fraser's warehouse. While workers had spent July picketing, managers had been inside, loading the white mountain of paper onto railroad cars. It filled 27 of them. For the strikers, the stakes were now clear. The fate of the shipment would determine the outcome of the strike. Ron Albert.
They were telling us that once these cars are loaded, they're going to move them out. The money to get of that, they could hold out the strike a lot longer. So the word got around, and the people said, there's no train leaving this property.
The plan to ship paper was not a complete surprise to the unions. In fact, they had inside information collected by wives of striking workers, some of whom worked in the management offices. So they had already made a plan to block the railroad tracks with large pieces of pulpwood and their own bodies.
I remember I went to the front line where the diesel was, and there was a person for the B&A telling us to get out. We had no right to be there, and people were listening. We may have no right to be here, but you have no right to move this paper either.
Newspapers would estimate that 75 strikers gathered on the railroad tracks.
People were standing next to the diesel, and I heard the guy tell the diesel operator, push him out. So he started moving the diesel forward very slowly. And I saw a few people almost get their foot caught between the diesel and the track. And a lot of people were seeing that. So people started jumping onto the diesel. When he saw people ganging up onto the diesel, he hightailed it out of there.
But Fraser and the B&A would not be deterred that easily. The next day they sent another engine, only to meet even more strikers, around 200 this time. Once again, the engine, aided only by a few local police, was unable to reach the warehouse. Union member Real Daigle recalls that the strikers tried to keep the peace, telling the officers, "Don't bother us, and we ain't gonna bother you." The strikers had won the first two battles, but Fraser President Pete Hoyer was not ready to back down. Strikers Paul and Jerry Cedar.
The governor of the state of Maine, who was Ken Curtis at the time, ordered in the state police, and they basically took over the town. There were policemen on every street corner, they were everywhere.
Somebody saw them at the old drive-in that they were massing up and getting ready. They were going to come down and break up the mob, which was probably what they were calling us.
They didn't really declare martial law in that you couldn't go on the streets, but they were there, you know, physically present, intimidatory. It was an occupation.
If the strikers were intimidated, they didn't show it.
I remember riding through town and razzing the police on the street corners and just, you know, trying to give them a hard time. There was no violence, just verbal stuff.
The razzing turned out to be a distraction, intentional or not, from preparations being made elsewhere. The strikers had learned that B&A planned to show up Monday morning while the town was still asleep, in hopes of avoiding another blockade. Striker Bob Gogan.
They were coming too early in the morning and everybody was sleeping, so we had to delay him. There was a coup d'etat. They had some little covert operation going on. I was on back of the water district there. We took some rails out like at 3 o'clock in the morning. They had to have a crew put the rails back in so that the train could pass, and that bought us some time.
The union leaders distanced themselves from that kind of activity because a lot of things that happened in retrospect probably were very illegal.
Former State Senator Judy Parody, whose father worked at the mill.
The brilliance of this, you know, these are little farm boys. They thought of everything.
By the time the train's crew had rebuilt the tracks, the sun was already rising, and the strikers were ready to begin the next phase of their operation. They were going to mobilize a much larger group of people to greet the train than they brought out on Thursday or Friday. To do this, they needed a signal. Dan Daigle.
The union men had set up somebody to ring the church bells, somebody to blow the horn and siren at the firehouse to alert the people that they were indeed moving the cranes.
We passed the message around to all the families that if you hear early morning blast, that means get your family on the tracks. Matter of fact, I was the one that would let the siren go. It was well planned. We were together, like a big team, you know.
It wasn't just the workers. It drew a whole bunch of other people down.
The whole town of Madawaska was standing on the railroad track, helping out the union members concerned about the job and the future of this town.
I often wonder if that isn't French mentality. We're going all together or we're not going at all. People up here, throughout the Acadian history, everything was family oriented. Families worked together on the farms, from the grandfather down to the youngest child in the house. I think that the roots of it, the heritage of it, I don't know if it's in the genes or the culture, but it's like we're going to do what we have to do to stand our ground. This is our bread and butter, and we are not going to starve.
I think it was close to 1,000 people maybe on that day on the railroad track and all around, everywhere outside.
The newspaper's estimate that the crowd numbered more than 300 people was more conservative. But even by the low estimates, the Madawaskans sitting on the narrow train tracks had the police outnumbered 10-1. Once again, they piled wood on the rails and stood together in the path of the locomotive.
We got down there and there was quite a crowd of demonstrators.
State Trooper Jerry LaPointe was not expecting to encounter such a large group or such a diverse one.
Women and children, men, and we deployed to try to get them away from the train, but they put the children in the front ranks, women in the second rank and the men behind them. And in theory was, we're all family men too. And you're not gonna whack a little kid or a woman, bottom line. So they took advantage of that weakness.
Dan Daigle was one of the men on the tracks.
I believe that the men figured if we have our wives and children sitting on the track, the train is going to stop. But if it's just a bunch of union men sitting on the track, management has so little respect for us, they're probably going to tell the train engineer, plow them over.
To me, that proves that there was never any intent to be violent. Never, never, because you never put your wife and children in harm's way.
But the state police had their orders. They were there to prevent the strikers from illegally blocking the paper shipment. So they reached into their arsenal of crowd control tactics. First, they tried to wedge their way through the crowd.
So wedge, push down through, split them up, without anybody getting hurt. And that didn't work well. There was more of them than there was of us.
We started watching these guys coming at us in formation, dressed in kind of riot gear. They came up to the crowd, tried to disperse the people, and everybody just stayed put, nobody moved.
At this point, the police made a decision that would change the nature of the day's encounter and of the entire strike.
They fired tear gas, the typical riot control stuff. As soon as they fired tear gas, that's when the riot started.
The state police opened up the tear gas, but the winds were blowing from the east, and the tear gas was blowing back into their face, so the crowd never got any tear gas. So that didn't work. What they started doing was shooting tear gas canisters right over the heads of the people, and they would come right down into the middle of the crowd. At that point, people started getting a little bit pissed off, so everybody picked up rocks and were lying on the side of the rails, and everybody started to throw rocks. I could remember a black cloud of rocks, and I'm guilty for throwing a few myself.
Trooper LaPointe remembers what went through his mind.
Oh my Jesus, you have a moment, brother, right then and there. Geez, they were whining to you. I mean, it was almost like an eclipse out there. The sky was so full of rocks.
Debbie Daigle was one of the children there.
I was about 11 or 12, and I really didn't understand what was going on. It was like a mini riot. I know I did throw some rocks, and I was a tomboy, and I had a good arm, and I kind of think I did cut someone in the face.
Those rocks down there, those tracks are pretty sharp. Some of your clothing will get shredded or you get cut up in your arms, but nothing serious. We got separated from the main body and got crowded in between two railroad cars. And then the crowd really got chanting and screaming. We stood there wondering how the hell we were going to get out of there. After a while, we watched them, and I told them, I said, they don't even know we're here anymore. We took our helmets off. We walked right through the crowd, and they never saw us. We get on the other side of it to get to safety. Took advantage of that mob mentality rule at that point.
Some strikers, feeling like they now had the upper hand, released their frustrations on the locomotives and the police cars.
A whole bunch of cars got turned upside down, and the state troopers were just running away because they were scared for their life.
Everybody started running to the place where the squad cars were parked, and I can still to this day remember 3 state troopers sitting in the squad car. The guy that was driving hadn't gotten there, and there was a 4-foot pulpwood in between the troopers in the back seat of the car.
They literally demolished 2 state police cruisers, and they totally demolished the locomotive of the train.
They never thought they were going to meet a whole bunch of people like that at the time. They were not ready for the number of people that was on site. So they had to just run away and leave the car there.
In a matter of minutes, the situation had transformed from a peaceful standoff to one of the largest violent confrontations between civilians and police in Maine's history. Word soon reached the governor's office in Augusta that the Madawaska powder keg had exploded. Dan Bagel.
The governor, Kenneth Curtis, right away he placed a phone call into the state police and told these boys, get out of there before somebody dies.
Trooper Jerry LaPointe remembers tempers cooling off almost as quickly as they had ignited.
The local people thought that enough was enough, and nobody wanted anybody to get hurt. So they de-escalated, and everybody moved out and caught a breath. And we were put on different posts around the area. And where one of us was, it'd be one of the, I guess a striker for lack of a better term, would be with you. And we would shake hands, hey, my name's Jerry, my name's Bob, and we just converse like a couple of guys.
In addition to calling off the state troopers, Governor Curtis decided to assess the situation in person. Neil Rode was his chief aide at the time.
The governor, he stuck his head in my office and said, we're going up to Madawaska.
The scene that awaited them was not pretty. Phil Dubois.
The rail cars were basically demolished. They left squad cars there and cars were overturned, all the windows broken.
As bad as the violence was, the Bangor Daily News reported the next day that there were no serious injuries, though there wasn't a trooper without rock-sized bruises. Amazingly, throughout all three attempts to ship the paper, not a single arrest was made. Paul Sear.
It could have been a lot worse than what it was. There were guns involved on both sides. I know that there were state police sharpshooters on the roof of the mill. My understanding was that even if the railroad had left with the boxcars, they would not have made it out of town. There were allegedly explosives planted. It could have been really, really bad.
I don't think that the management group and I don't think that the law enforcement realized the animosity that was built up in these people.
Dan Daigle.
That they were willing to risk anything and everything. They anticipated this strike coming for a long time. They got prepared for it and they meant business.
That afternoon, Fraser released a statement signed by John Hoyer.
Fraser Management has attempted to save customers and jobs in making this shipment of paper, but chooses not to risk serious injury to members of the community.
When this message was broadcast over the radio late Monday afternoon, the remaining strikers began to disperse. Fraser would make no further attempts to ship the paper. State police returned the next day to retrieve the truck and the two cruisers, one overturned, that they had left at the scene of the riot.
They stopped at my dad's store to get a soda to drink and everything. One of the state troopers, my dad asked him, says, so all your fun over and done with over here, or what? And the guy opened his shirt. And right here next to the collar, he had a nice big blue mark. I'm assuming one of the rocks hit its mark. And I remember this statement very well. He says, I've never seen Madawaska. I hope I never see Madawaska again.
Governor Curtis arrived Monday evening, determined to restart the negotiations that had been stalled for over a month. Neil Rode.
I remember we met in a high school, and the management was in one classroom and the workers were the other. But we met first by the workers, if I remember, and very fired up. I mean, these were very hot-headed people, and Ken was trying to calm them down. And on the other side, it was just the same, you know. When are you going to call in the National Guard and start shooting these people? That was hyperbole, but that was almost the way they were talking about it. There was one guy, I can't remember his name, and he was a loudmouth in our gun, and he was, you know, you got to stomp on these people, and you got to, you know, force them to do what we want. And there was an arrogance among those kinds of people that was just beyond belief.
Unsurprisingly, negotiations didn't take off immediately, and when the next contract offer was put in front of the workers The four locals rejected it by an overwhelming 591 to 48 margin.
Paychecks were higher.
Talks could have gone on much longer, but the process was accelerated by outside circumstances.
The time has come for decisive action. Action that will break the vicious circle of spiraling prices and costs.
President Nixon addressed the nation on August 15, 1971.
I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days.
Although there was no indication that Nixon was aware of the Fraser strike, his historic wage and price freeze, designed to slow inflation, had the side effect of taking further wage increases off the table. The eventual contract included a raise that was just 5 cents more than what Fraser had offered at the beginning of negotiations more than 4 months earlier. Paul Sear.
So essentially what the company did, if I recall right, they offered us a nickel to come back to work. And given the writing on the wall, people went back to work, and that was the end of the strike. When we went back to work, again, it was with a very bitter taste in the mouths of the workers.
But there were reasons to see the outcome as a win for the unions. For one, they held on to the Manning letters and had reason to expect that this time they would be respected because Pete Hoyer and Marty Roach were gone. Michael Hiller.
What in the end sunk Hoyer and the people that he brought in from Great Northern Paper was overplaying their hand and thinking that they could get the unions to accept whatever they would want, and that turned out not to be the case. The strike was very costly, an estimated $4 million in lost profits, and based on that, the shareholders of the firm decided that it was time for him to go.
I think after that we started getting better contracts. So I think that maybe that was one of the turning points for Fraser, because I mean, when we said we weren't happy with their conditions, we were listened to, which I think was a move forward. A very bad experience, but not a bad result from it.
In the aftermath of the strike, Fraser's owners took steps that would begin to heal the rift over language and culture that had dated from the mill's founding. Within a few years, Fraser hired Bill Laframboise, a French speaker, to be mill manager. Such a hiring would have been unheard of before the strike, and he became one of Fraser's most popular managers, a bridge between the mill and his workers.
Didn't get 100% what we wanted. Monetary-wise, we didn't get much, but we got the respect that the people needed in that mill.
The period following the Fraser strike coincided with a worldwide resurgence of interest in the Acadian diaspora. Louise Peltier.
Let's say since 1970 there's been a huge explosion of recognition and embracing this Acadian identity, and it has been manifested in literature, arts, research.
In the Upper St. John Valley, this could be seen in a number of new organizations with an historical focus. Judy Parody.
That's when it started in the 70s, early 70s. Now every community has a historical society, and the promouvoir la langue, la culture, for the keep the language and the culture.
A central piece of this mission is Madawaska's annual Acadian Festival, now in its 39th year, which always features a reunion for one of the valley's several large Acadian families.
Every year a different family is chosen. The name of the family might not appear on a list of names from Acadia in 1755. But the word Acadian has come to mean the French-speaking people in the St. John Valley. They are still called an Acadian family and celebrated as such.
Perhaps there is a connection between the remarkable uprising of Madawaska's French paper workers and the resurgence of cultural pride in the valley.
It probably was the first time we flexed our muscles and had felt that we'd proven our point. And, I do believe that it made us appreciate who we were, some of the qualities we had.
Don Scher is the president of the Musée Culturel de Mont-Carmel in Lille, just a few miles down Route 1 from the mill. The museum is housed in an early 20th century church whose congregation once included many Fraser workers and their families.
In 1973, they put the church in St. David and the church here in Lille on the National Register of Historic Places. So I think there was more of an awareness of how our history needed to be woven into the fabric of the history of the state of Maine, because we tend to be ignored up here when you talk about Maine history. I think with the Fraser strike, there was a sense of empowerment. A grassroots movement accomplished something. And if they could accomplish that economically, what could we accomplish if we worked together culturally?
Madawascan Rebellion was produced by Gabe Graben and Michael Hillard with assistance from Shay Shackelford. Narration by Berman Banville. Additional voicing by Dan Béchard and Paul Beaver. Thanks to Sheila Jans, Guy Dubé, Lise Pelletier, and everyone who shared their stories with us. This program was made possible by support from the Maine Humanities Council and the University of Maine at Fort Kent, and is dedicated to the memory of Bob Gauguin.
As a matter of fact, I was the one that would let the siren go.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now we're going to go to the discussion panel portion of the evening. And so I'd like to invite Dr. Nicolas. Michael, are you going to come up here as well? Okay. And Mr. Paul Cyr to come up. And to moderate the panel discussion and questions, I have asked Dr. Paul Buck from the university here. Paul Buck has a PhD from the University of Maine at Orono. Actually, he and I were graduate students together. Small world. He also has an MA in Spanish from Middlebury College and a BA in Canadian Studies and Multi-Languages from St. Lawrence University. He's an Associate Professor of History and Education at the University of Maine at Fort Kent. He's been teaching here since 2015. His areas of expertise are the St. John Valley history, Canadian history, trends, and curriculum design in teaching. What?
Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to take this time again to thank Dr. Michael Hilliard, who's here with us, and also to introduce our panelists here. I'll start here with Paul Cyr. Monsieur Cyr was born in Van Buren and grew up in Madawaska. He graduated from high school in Madawaska in 1968, then went to Northeastern University in Boston to study engineering, spent 2 years there. Started working at Fraser in 1970, and in 1976, he was elected Secretary and Treasurer of the Maine District Council of Pulp and Paper Mill Workers, and that's an organization of all of the United Paper Workers International Union members and locals in Maine. In 1978, Paul was fired from Fraser for disobedience and insubordination for refusing to perform unsafe work, and Paul maintains that he was fired for his union activity. He worked for OSHA, Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration, federally, starting in 1980, and after 22 years retired. And now he operates a safety and health consulting business called Paul Cyr Safety Services. Dr. Nicolin is professor of Acadian and Canadian history at Université de Moncton, Campus d'Edmundston, for approximately 30 years. She's been there for that amount of time. She is at this time the head of the humanities sector at the University of Moncton campus at Edmundston. Her present research is on history of work in Acadia and also on memory locations that are throughout the Acadian portion of New Brunswick. And her second book, which is called Histoire de l'Acadie, which I have here, and actually I use in my St. John Valley history class as a reference. She has written with Nicolas Landry, and the second edition appeared in 2014. She's just finished a manuscript on the history of the Fraser Company in Edmundston from 1918 to 1985, and the manuscript has, or will soon be, submitted for publication. And Elise Pelletier has a MA in French from the University of Maine at Orono in 2002. She's a Maine State Certified Teacher of French K through 12. She also graduated with a double BA in English and French literatures from the Université de Moncton, Campus d'Edmundston, right in Edmundston, New Brunswick. Her areas of expertise are the history of Acadians and the St. John Valley and Acadian literature. And she's been the director of the Acadian Archives, Archives Acadiennes, at UMFK since 2007. So now we will commence the roundtable.
Mike, if I could for just a minute, one of the voices you heard on the recording was that of Rael Daigle, and I'd just like to take a moment to, Rael yesterday suffered a mild stroke and is in the hospital here in Fort Kent, so I just would like to say, you know, keep him in your prayers. I stopped and saw him on my way up here tonight, and he's doing pretty good, but I just wanted to mention that that's so that you can keep him in your prayers. I'd also like to take a second to remember some of the people that I recall being influenced by and being and working with through the 70s when I was both president of my local and my time at Fraser. So I'd just like to take a second to remember O'Neill Rossingall, Dick Burns, Cliff Gagnon, Bob Gogan certainly, and then the then president of the Maine AFL-CIO, Charlie O'Leary, and the labor liaison for the U.S. Department of Labor in New England, a guy named Eddie Egan. So again, just a moment of reflection on those folks who were very strong trade unionists during the 70s.
So at this time, we'd like to take some questions from the audience for Dr. Nicolin and for Monsieur Paul-Cyr.
Qui va poser la première question? The first question is always it's a bit touchy. Yes.
How many workers does Fraser have now in Madawaska compared to what they had at the top of the? Said about 1,000 at one time?
I think Fraser, at its strongest employment, my recollection is right around 1,100. Today, I'd be surprised if there are 400 left. At the time I was elected president, not president, but secretary-treasurer of the district council, we were 14,000 paper workers strong in the state of Maine. And I called the Maine AFL-CIO yesterday, and there are fewer than 2,500 today. So that gives you a little bit of an indication of where the
employment has gone.
And in Edmundston, it's around 300. Okay, give and take.
And Nicole, what was Edmundston at its peak?
Over 1,000, depending on the period of the year, but during the summer, over 1,000. But there was always a bit less workers in Edmundston once Madawaska grew, but it was mostly between 600 and 900, depending on the year. Okay. And what you have to understand is the link between these two mills. The physical link, the pulp is made in Edmundston and then sent through the pipelines to the mill in Madawaska. But over the years, the link is more than just the physical link between the two buildings. Some people from Edmundston worked in Madawaska. Like during the strike, 168 workers lived in Edmundston back then, but were employees of the Madawaska mill. Also, the other fact that's important during that strike is that they laid off around 300 workers from the Edmundston mill also. So the link has been there all through the years. Another interesting fact is that Edmundston was not very happy when they decided to build in Madawaska in 1925. They thought that the city of Edmundston really tried to change the minds of the owners, because their argument was that when Frasers came to Edmundston in 1917 and started building the mill, they signed a contract with the city of Edmundston and they got really important concessions. They didn't pay much taxes, and the city felt back then that when it was time to build another mill, a paper mill, they would also build it in Edmundston. So when in 1920 and then 24, they went to see the town council to have permission to build the pipeline, the city of Edmundston did not say yes immediately. They tried to stall and they tried to have another decision from the Frasers, Mathesons, and Brebners, but they didn't have a case. The mill was built in Madawaska. So over the years, I think it's important to understand that there's really a link between those two mills.
More questions? I'll use my teacher voice here. More questions for everyone?
Well, I'd like to know, yes. You didn't hit on the support that the Canadian mill workers gave to the Madawaska workers during the strike. I think Paul probably could answer that.
Boy, I really don't have much recollection. I know that they were supported, that the union workers across were supported, but I don't have any, unless somebody in the audience that was there at the time might have some direct information. I really...
I remember them sending money and food.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's, Phil just said that he remembers the Canadian unionists sending money and food to help support the strike, so that was certainly very important at the time.
Yeah. What you have to understand is that when you look at the union history, it's quite different on the Canadian side than on your side. You had 4 unions inside the mill. In Edmundston, there was a local for the people who worked in the offices, but the mill workers, whether they worked in maintenance or the pulp workers, were in one local. Okay, there was only one union. And there was division within the union. When I interviewed about 30 workers in Edmundston, and they hated Hoyer and Roach as much as you did in Madawaska, that's for sure. The cockroach, well, I heard it time and time and time and time again. But what came out of those interviews was that the changes, the modernization, really hit hard on the pulp workers, whereas the maintenance workers could get more hours, and they hired more maintenance workers when they laid off pulp workers. And the union was, the people in charge of the union were maintenance guys. So I could feel that there was a division inside the union in Edmundston, which was not the same history being written in Madawaska. So I think that that's a factor that's important. Another factor, in the 1970s, at the beginning of the 1970s in Canada, the guys that used to be members of the International Brotherhood of Pulp and Paper Mill Workers will join a Canadian union. They will leave the international union and join another union in Canada. So a lot of changes going on in the union history at that time. So it's a complex history when you look at it.
I'd like to add something to what Nicole just said, and that is that I think we cannot overstress the geographic and cultural context in which this strike happened. And when you say, well, the Canadian workers and the American workers, you're actually talking about two sides of a pie, right? Two halves of a pie, where I know Nicole and I have family on both sides. And when one side hurts, the other is there. So when you think about the culture and the sense of community that has prevailed for, we can now say, centuries, it is not unusual or unheard of that the Canadians would come to the aid of Americans and sympathize.
Yeah. And the discrimination factor was a factor in Edmundston also. The bosses were English, the workers were French. One of the guys that was president for the many years, Crabtree, he was there from the 1940s until the 1960s. And during the interview, and I interviewed a couple of Anglophones who were close to him, and they told me that he often said during meetings that for all the time that I'll be president, no Frenchman will have a job in higher management. Okay, so the discrimination factor was really an important factor in Madawaska, but also in Edmundston. And it's like that in many pulp mills. Huh? Studies have been made in other mills in Quebec and in Dalhousie, for example, International Paper. It was the same discrimination factor that was in place at that time in the pulp and paper industry.
And I think it's important also to stress that this is not an American English versus French-Canadian Americans, you know, two sides. This is really because you could see it on both the Canadian side and the American side. It's Anglophones and Francophones.
And they did not mix, huh? Even when you look at where people lived.
Yes.
In Edmundston, we called it le coin des Anglais, no? The corner, the English corner, yeah. The big houses where the bosses from Fraser lived. And we didn't mix with those kids because they were Protestants and they were Anglophones. And we were Catholics and we were French. And it was, I grew up, it was really, and I grew up, I was born in 1960, and there was no mixing between the people. So it's an interesting sociological study to be made there.
I'm going to jump in and just add a little piece there, which is looking at some of the parallel mill communities, and the ones that stand out include S.D. Warren and Westbrook, Hollingsworth and Whitney, which became a Scott mill that was in Waterville, and Rumford, especially Oxford, that the outside managers outside that would come in, it was really quite typical for them to settle in and not leave. And I think that sort of divide that existed here, you can just see the contrast. You take the Francophone ethnic piece out in other places, and there wasn't that aversion. So the aversion of those, I mean, I'm speculating, but the aversion of those English-speaking managers who came here and made a point to leave when they retired really stands out, because it really didn't happen at other mills in Maine.
Yeah.
I actually have a personal link to that discrimination. My father, Louis Pee Wee Sear, was the superintendent of the finishing room
at the mill, and also the bond coder, which was running at the time. And when Marty Roach came in and they started the purge, or purges, he assigned an English named person to bird dog my father and sort of learn what my father did. And then subsequently, my father was removed as superintendent of the finishing room and the bond coder. And I remember that I remember the mill calling my father because they had a problem with some certain thing that they couldn't fix, and would my father go down there and help them fix it? And my father would do it. And it just struck me that, and I said to my father, Pop, why would you do that? He said, well, he says, sometimes, Paul, he says, that mill is the lifeblood of the town, and it's got to run if the town's going to run. So, and luckily, at the time that the town manager position was vacant, and I remember that the union workers at the mill, all 4 locals, circulated petitions for my father to be hired as the town manager, and he subsequently was. So I thought that was pretty cool.
And they had all sorts of strategies, those presidents and vice presidents, etc. If a worker did his work and did not cause too much problems, they would hire his sons. Or they would hire uncle, or, you know. So it was a family thing also. That was kind of a strategy that they put in place when they opened the mill in 1918 in Edmundston. It's going to be 100 years this autumn that this mill has started. And they've done that year and year and year, year after year after year. So if you wanted your son to have a job, then you shut up in the mill. Even if you saw some discrimination, you didn't dare speak up because you wanted other members of your family to have a job. And it was the main employer in Edmundston back then. So it's really an interesting story, and I think that the discrimination factor, the whole story of the discrimination has yet to be written. There's a lot of stuff out there.
To also reflect back on the 4 locals that are in place versus 1 in Edmundston, during my years as president of Local 365, I always felt that the mill was pretty adept at playing off the catalog local versus the bond local versus 365. Not so much the office workers, but the 3 locals that were involved in the paper making process. In 1972, Dick Burns and I were the delegates for Local 365 to the merger convention in Florida, where the paper makers and paper workers, which was the bond and the catalog mill workers, and the International Brotherhood of Pulp and Sulfite mill workers, which was the maintenance and the boiler house workers, and it merged those 2 international unions into one, into what was known then as the United Paper Workers International Union. That new international union did not merge the 3 locals that were merged into the UPIU, and I always thought that was a mistake on the part of the international union. And I guess just my suspicious nature tells me that was probably calculated.
Yes, sir.
If I can bring us from 1971 up to today, or let's say the last 10 years or so, obviously Fraser has gone through a lot of changes, is now Twin Rivers. It doesn't seem to me that the language and francophone, anglophone issue is as strong as it was. But some of the other factors that you identified, the rationalization, the guys running around with stopwatches, expert management coming in from outside to come and make everything productive, that's very much part of the discourse. I mean, look, at the moment we teach our forestry students to go around with stopwatches. I mean, we're teaching them to be little cockroaches.
or the Irving model. Yeah, no, but that's true. That's how they do it. I'm not. It's not that I want to hit on Irving, but it's a strategy, and you can get. It goes back to Frederick Taylor, Taylorism. So it's today. Well, I'm an historian, so we like to have a bit of time to look at things. So what I can say is that I think there's still some, I can mostly talk about what's going on the Canadian side of the border. The pension issue in Edmundston, the wounds have not healed yet. When Brookfield Management declared bankruptcy, the workers right after that learned that their pension pay would be cut at least 40%. So many of them don't have a salary that they can live with comfortably. So they're still hurting. I think that there's still some traces of that. The language issue is not a big issue like it was in the 1970s and before that, because Francophones have more management jobs now, are in jobs where they can have take part in the decision process, which was not the case back then. So I think the language issue is not as important as it was back then. But I was speaking with Nicolas from Twin Rivers before we started today, and he was telling me that there's still some méfiance. C'est quoi méfiance en anglais? Distrust. And I think that's, you have to know the history to understand that. Even though Francophones are occupying those jobs right now, and they're in the management, they're responsible to negotiate, the workers still don't trust management completely. And I think it comes from a long history of discrimination that happened at Fraser's on both sides of the border.
Civil War, we had Madawaska on the Wildcat strike, where it pitted fathers against sons and brothers against brothers, and it was pretty wild. And I thought it was at 68 or 69 where one union went on strike, but
no, my recollection is the Wildcat strike was in 1970, and it was during the time when there were a lot of construction workers here building number 8 paper machine. And that's where I started at Fraser, was on a crew that was rebuilding number 8, and we were doing a lot of major renovations to the catalog mill. And at some point there was some issues in the mill where there was a Wildcat strike, because what happened was that the boiler house people shut down the boiler house, which shuts down the mill. And I remember that they set up picket lines, and it was a very contentious strike. I remember we did not cross the picket lines. Our shop stewards at the time of the construction unions said you are not to get involved, but do not cross the picket lines. So I remember it was in the fall, because I didn't have to work for that time, and I'd go goose hunting during the day. That's what I remember doing when we didn't have to work. But I do recall that that Wildcat strike went back and forth for I think at least a week, where it'd get settled, and then it would be not settled, and the workers in the boiler house were fired, then hired back, then fired again. And you're right, it was a very, there were a lot of different factions pulling and pushing against one another. I do remember the managers going into the mill, and the strikers, there were puddles of water, and they would put nails in the puddles of water and force the cars that were bringing the managers into the mill to drive through the puddle, and with the natural results. That's really about all I remember about the Wildcat strike. As soon as number 8 paper machine was built, I went to work full-time in the mill, in the boiler house, and that's how I got into the local 365.
Okay, I see one more question back there, and then there's one up front here.
It's 2 questions, really. During the strike, it was indicated in the presentation that a lot of strikers left the area because they could not afford to survive. Now, how many of those, do you have any idea, did leave, and how long did it take those who stayed to regain what they lost during the strike?
Well, I recall it took, I don't have any recollections about who left, but I do know that there were people that left and went to work other jobs. And as far as regaining what the workers lost, as far as, you know, the monetary side of it, I know that it took years. And it was in 1974, the first year I was president of Local 365, we had negotiations that year. Again, very contentious. The contract was rejected at least twice, but when push really came to shove, the workers who were still trying to get back on their feet from the 71 strike voted by not a real close margin to, you know, swallow it again and accept the contract and keep working. But I do know that it took years.
The 168 workers that were on strike in Madawaska that lived in Edmundston organized a march in the streets of the city, and they pleaded with the conservative government of Richard Hadfield, who had been elected in 1970, had been there a couple of years, to help them because financially they could not put food on the table. And that was quite a big thing on the Canadian side of the border. A lot of people really tried to help those workers from the Madawaska mill who lived on the Canadian side. And the government, the Richard Hadfield government said no, they didn't want to create something, and every time someone was on strike, they would have to help them. So, but people were really desperate, and a lot of letters were published in the newspaper La Madawaska on the Canadian side, and it was letters from the workers asking for help to put food on the table. So it was really a very hard period for the workers.
I saw a question up here, and then
I remember the Wildcat strike. We used to walk our dad down to the mill because the production workers were working, and the maintenance workers were picketing. So they'd have to get through the picket line to get into their job. So it was really tough. You know, we walked my father down. We were 17 and 18 years old to make sure he could get through the picket line to get to his job.
Okay,
confrontations.
Yeah, that triggers another memory that it was Local 365 that Wildcat struck, and the paper workers kept making paper. But I still was pretty proud of the fact that the construction workers didn't cross the picket line.
Could I invite you to speculate about the future? If this mill is the lifeblood of Edmundston and Madawaska, and really in large part the valley, and as we look at what's happened to mills throughout the state of Maine, well, we're all afraid, and maybe you don't want to even speculate. But what's our future here, and how does that have an effect on the Acadian community? And in that particular context, there was in the Acadian Peninsula a movement for cooperatives that spread throughout this area during economic hard times in the 1930s. Very Acadian. It was behind the formation of credit unions. We had other farm cooperatives here. It was very successful until after World War II. But it basically involved the people taking control and running businesses. Do we have any potential for that here? What do you think about that?
I'd like to speak to that because it's one of the themes in my book, and it takes us away from the St. John Valley and Fraser Paper to S.G. Warren and Westbrook. But what I alluded to in my talk was the loss of that sort of local steady ownership, and that's a story about global corporate capitalism over the last 50 years. Obviously, virtually every paper mill in the state has been owned by private equity companies over the last 15 or 20 years. And on a good day, you might consider that to be a mixed bag because there's still some investment backing to keep certain parts of these older mills running. Often it's done at the expense of running those mills into the ground, what's left of them, that sort of thing. So it's very hard to see where that's going to go. But a really interesting thing happened in the Westbrook Mill, which is that when the Westbrook Mill had been purchased by Scott in 1968, and relations really weren't that bad for about 20 years. They kind of left the old local mill manager in place, a guy named Howard Reike, for 18 years. But then in the late 1980s, when this real incredible push, at least in the United States, from Wall Street to insist that every company downsize 50% of their employees and squeeze the rest that are left behind, started to hit Scott. And the unions, I was a young professor then, they called me up and they said, you've helped us out with the J strike, you're an economist, can you help us figure out how to buy this mill so we can run it ourselves? I was honest. I said, I have no idea what advice I should give you, but I do know some people in Cambridge who do this kind of work. So I found some folks to help them. And they made a bid to buy that mill. And the way they talked about it, and the way I've heard paper workers around Maine talk about the last 25 or 30 years, is that, you know, in the end, it was the people on the floor who really knew how to make the paper. That was the thing that was less and less respected over time, first of all, and then secondly, you know, why waste that? And who's more committed to these mills as institutions going on than the people in the community? So I think that there was an impulse within the paper industry, the state, to do the very thing that you're talking about. And I think one of the things that I see both in Maine and across the country, really internationally, everybody should look up the story of Mondragon in Basque Spain. But there's a strong recognition that the kind of what economists call corporate governance, the who owns a corporation and to what purpose, that has come to dominate the landscape here and elsewhere over the last 30 years is really at odds with the interests of the people who are actually doing the work. And I think cooperatives are increasing and growing. Worker-owned, especially cooperatives, are regaining a kind of currency of the sort that you talked about happening in other historical periods, happening around the U.S. and around the world. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to the idea that if the purpose of the corporation is to do something more than simply make profit for the shareholders, why not have the workers who are the most committed, have most to lose at the center of the ownership and control of those companies?
On a time pour deux autres questions. Time for two more questions.
Yeah, okay. I'll follow on that one, if I may, because there's Quebec has had a number of cooperative and locally owned forest industries. Some of them work well. The one that was the best known, of course, was Tembec, which was set up as a local buyout. I forget if they bought out a sawmill or a paper mill, but it was the big company that wanted to get rid of it as insufficiently productive. And I think we were talking early 90s, something like that. I'm not quite sure, or maybe someone else knows. And so that was locally controlled, locally run, not a cooperative, but a local ownership model. But then following the sort of logic that Michael mentioned right at the very beginning, you've got to grow bigger, you've got to get more capitalization. So Tembec kept on buying and needed more capital and changed its ownership structures, and eventually became functionally indiscernible. You know, it looked just like all the others. It carried out its operation in a way very, very similar to any other big forestry company. And I think last year or the year before finally got bought out by someone else. So, you know, I'm not quite sure. You know, it started off well with exactly the model that you were talking about, and then sort of lost that nature.
Yeah. And you have to think about the investments that would be needed to modernize. Because with all the problems that this company has known in the last couple of decades, not a lot of money has been invested in the equipment, which was one of the qualities of Fraser Companies Limited for a long time. When you look at the history of that company, they regularly spent money to put in new equipment and to be more efficient. They invested a lot research also, like Michael said in his documentary. But right now you would need to put a lot of money to modernize both mills, and it would be quite a challenge. But you know, a lot of people thought Fraser would be dead at the end of the 1990s. That company has died, and elle a ressuscité plusieurs fois, là, hein? Because every time it was... one thing I can say is that I think the region is not as dependent on that company as it was during the first half of the 20th century. The two main employers in the region were the railroads and the Fraser Paper and Fraser Companies Limited. But I think it has changed since then. And it's not as many jobs, though. It's around 300. It's a big employer in Edmundston, and in Madawaska it's still a big employer. But I know on the Canadian side, it's not the only employer now. So it's hard to say. The one thing, becoming a cooperative, that would surprise me because of the investment that are needed.
Alors, bonsoir et merci d'être venu.